New worlds are forming and becoming visible in the 21st century. The anthropologists at UC Santa Cruz have each chosen a charismatic object. Through them, we tell stories about confluences and concatenations among the worlds that are emerging.
I'm an archaeologist who analyzes animal bones from archaeological sites. This item is especially interesting because it has a mark across the end of it that is made by a metal tool. And why that's interesting is that it is in the context of tens of thousands of stone tools. This bone, to me, and the other one, are really portals into thinking about the emergence of new social and economic spaces in East Africa about 2,000 years ago. Pastoralists had a lot to lose socially and economically by letting in the technology and very esoteric ideology and real power in a spiritual sense as well as a social sense of ironworking. So that I see this not as the product of isolation, this 800-year gap in the adoption of metal by the pastoral peoples of the Serengeti, the Mara, and the Athi Plains, but rather as resistance, as deliberate choice not to go down that particular road and to stay with their more traditional technologies in order to maintain their social and economic independence.
The object I chose to exhibit is a beautiful sari made in the villages of Odisha, India. This would be a symbol of religious harmony, interreligious dialogue, and a wonderful understanding of different religious practices. This is the beautiful way of displaying the confluence of Hindu and Buddhist culture in their own artifact.
These little statues are given in recognition of men and women who sit on a committee to organize annual collective weddings. The idea is because they're contracted by the community and done under the watchful gaze of the community, the girls will not be subject to domestic violence and will be protected. So this statue is really about recognizing these leaders and their dedication to Danga uplift.
1972 or 73, Palestinian refugees came to Zuni and they started to sell silver and turquoise ornaments which Zunis were making. They were dealing with new kind of material because of their contacts with other tribes or other people. But some of their themes from their traditional mythology and things like that continued, So even though globalization and other things have brought all kinds of opportunities, many of their traditional themes continue to give them meaning.
In order to predict climate change impacts, we have to measure what happens in forests by using these small tree tags to mark out trees that we return to remeasure after 5 and 10 year intervals. These tags are interesting because they can be thought of as opening up a portal into a new kind of world. At present, they are being used to open a portal into a world about apocalyptic climate change impacts upon forests, which are hopefully to be averted by paying people money to stop doing bad things to their forests. In my work in Mexico, the people who do these kinds of measurements are indigenous people. Indigenous people in this area realize that forests are recovering from histories of logging and depredation by outside companies, and forest area is increasing. Outside land cover change scientists think that indigenous people in these forests are the ones who are destroying them and hope to profit from this by selling averted deforestation in world carbon markets. Efforts to protect forests are premised upon a long-term story of landscape change, and these people have a different story of landscape change from the story that the scientists are telling. And both of these stories have to be aligned if any effort to give them money to protect their forests is going to work in the long run. I suggest that if we pay close attention, these tags could open a portal to something much more hopeful, which is one in which indigenous people are supported in their continuing efforts to protect their forests and where they are recognized as being the guardians of these forests and as not having been destructive.
For years now, I've been studying peer review and the ways in which grant proposals are analyzed, programs are evaluated. A whole range of decisions are made about what work has value. All of us as scholars and scientists are always doing creative work. To do it at the same time, we often have to depend for funding on working through bureaucratic contexts in which people are trained, socialized, and guided into particular forms of making decisions, of which important notice number 130 is one example.
I chose the U.S. Treasury bond because it's an emerging world object about a changing relationship between the United States and China. This is a portal into transnational capitalism. It probably is the most important object that is tying the United States and China together. The United States decided to wage these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they're the first wars in U.S. history that the United States has not paid for itself. Because at the same time that they decided to wage these wars, the Bush administration lowered taxes. So they didn't have the money to pay for the wars. So they started selling bonds. China bought up a lot of U.S. Treasury bonds. And it has made China the second largest holder of U.S. debt. Now, this debt makes the United States both upset and nervous, but anthropologists have studied debt for a long time. And in the anthropological literature, debt is a positive thing. It's something that binds people together, that makes them mutually dependent, that makes them take care of each other, and that lowers inequalities. So I think we could rethink this relationship of debt into one of mutual dependence that might actually make us think about friendship rather than competitive enemies.
What intrigued me about this magazine was that it was attempting some kind of new collaboration, something a little more interactive, something a little less, certainly much less hostile, but almost benign and friendly. And it's a different generation of evangelicals that we're working with here, and that's being appealed to here. And these are evangelicals who are at home in the world and want to figure out how to engage it on their terms, but also its terms. And this magazine reflects that. And if you take a look at the inside of it, you'll see that there's Bible text, but there's also text columns, sidebars that are designed to appeal to teenage girls in this case. The world that I think these magazines are helping to produce and reflect the coming into existence of is one of Americans, a new kind of American that is both religious and secular. These are citizens who would, in some ways and at some times, consider themselves or think of themselves in much of the way we think of ourselves. They listen to rock and roll, they follow politics, they can be either Democrats or Republicans, they can be liberals or conservatives, they can be environmentalists, they could be vegans, they can be whatever anyone else is, and Christian. And the kinds of evangelicals that they're descended from did not think of themselves this way. They thought of themselves as more separatist and devoted a good deal of more energy into creating separate worlds that were apart from what they called the culture or the secular world or simply the world.
A Michael Jordan basketball jersey and some Nike high-top sneakers. These kinds of items were quite popular among folks I did fieldwork with in Honduras. One friend of mine referred to this practice as, this is the black power we wear. I think that power derived from a sense of connectedness to blacks elsewhere. Their power also derives, I think, from their association with these same corporations. Wearers of this style were both tapping into a kind of anti-racist sentiment, but at the same time tapping into essentially U.S. imperialism. Nike itself took on blackness as a kind of commodified form to try to promote its brand and kind of create a brand. I think these objects are portals into an emerging world in which forms of identities that have historically been rendered abject, subordinately other, have increasingly taken on a different kind of symbolic freight.
This bowl and this Ho-Chunk corn is a very powerful portal into my sense of who I am as a Ho-Chunk person. Native people maintain connections to their reservations and their homelands through the spokes of the wheel. And through those spokes, it would include traveling back and forth, phone calling. It would also include through your imagination, such as reading tribal newspapers or going online. There are many, many ways that this hub works. And so the Indian corn in the soup and eating the soup, it imagines for me this connection to my Ho-Chunk homelands, my Ho-Chunk culture, and this connection is through this kind of what I would call a hub consciousness.
This kind of pottery that has this kind of polychrome, different color painting on it, and this much more iconographic designs. Here's a little bird wing here from a parrot. And this particular kind of paint, which we call glaze paint, it's actually a melted fused glass that's been used as paint to outline the figures on this pot. It was a new innovation that came to the Southwest at the end of the 13th and the beginning of the 14th century, and the knowledge for how to produce this was spread from the western part of the Pueblo area to the eastern Pueblo area by migrants. And the 14th century was a very turbulent time in the Southwest, a time when we see the emergence of new societies in the Southwest as people abandoned large parts of the Southwest and moved to other parts of the Southwest and formed new communities and new societies. And these pots were very important to that process.
These tablets came onto the market about maybe 5 years ago. It's related to the dulce berry, which if you consume it either in berry form or powder form, or now they make it in tablet form, it transforms or alters your sense of taste. And I believe that taste really completely makes us think about emergent worlds. Since my research is on food and medicine, I'm very curious about how our notions of taste influence the way we think about food and medicine. I believe the miracle tablets are a portal onto the emerging worlds of taste, that we often overlook the other senses. We think about objects in a visual sense, or perhaps in terms of tactility, or in terms of hearing. But we really don't think of it in terms of taste. But yet it's the most immediate sensation when we think about other possibilities.
Up this discarded cigarette packet in the National Forest in Central Oregon, where I was studying global connections of science, commerce, and ecology around a particular wild mushroom that's very valued in Japan called matsutake mushrooms. People who are picking matsutake mushrooms in Oregon are often refugees from Laos and Cambodia. I was thinking about the problem of how they figured out where to go. When you're looking for mushrooms, you're looking down on the ground. You're rarely looking at big landmarks, and you have to be off trail, and you're often going in circles, and it's very hard to figure out where you are. And this is a completely unfamiliar environment for all of these people. So I could see how they were learning to notice details. When you saw a piece of trash and then you came on it again, you could see exactly where you were in terms of a route. And suddenly it became a way to understand the forest and to begin to feel at home in the forest. I was excited by the fact that it was also an artifact of the transnational trade in plants, in manufactured goods, in artistic styles, and all kinds of things that the Southeast Asians who've moved to the US are bringing with them. Through this cigarette package, I see how the United States is changing through the immigrants that are coming into the United States. I see how the forest landscape itself, which we try to understand in a particular set of ways, now interwoven in that landscape are the understandings and practices of new kinds of Americans who are joining the world of the forest and also the world of trade and travel. So I see emerging from this transnational and cosmopolitan worlds in even very unexpected places like the middle of a national forest.
This is a broken compass, and it's a broken compass of the sort that Dutch colonial officials used in the 1930s when they were exploring the interior of Western New Guinea and trying to establish a colonial presence there. It being broken is important because this whole idea of technological superiority actually was spawned by people who were in many ways technologically inferior in the face of their Papuan guides and hosts. Time and again they were trying to demonstrate how modern technology was better at doing things, and the technology would fail them. So I felt like this was a really good representation of the way that colonial dreams of having power over people come out of vulnerability and not in fact superiority.
Well, I chose to exhibit this piece of Spanish colonial roof tile. This particular piece of colonial roof tile comes from Mission San Antonio de Padua, which is near Jolón, California. Its significance is that it allows us to think about emergent identities coming together and creating forced relocations and kind of really restructuring a lot of indigenous society, but at the same time, it was a moment in which indigenous identity was transformed really in horribly harsh ways and radical ways, but it's a transformation that's important to understand in terms of modern indigenous identities and the power and authority in which many descendant groups, have or don't have in relationship to archaeological sites and cultural heritage. This roof tile is a portal or door to production of knowledge and productions of power. But I think it's a connection between the past and present in a really substantial way, because the past and how the past has been constructed has affected how power and authority and law and access that people today have. So those two are very much intricately intertwined, and we as archaeologists have to pay attention to it. The tourist industry in California has turned it into this romanticized ideal of these beautiful adobe walls and rose gardens, but these tiles were produced by and for a particular group of people in very particular structural power relationships.
Well, the traffic barrier is a node or a portal into an emerging Muslim French community. And one of the things that really interests me is the way in which the state manages or regulates Muslims and the Muslim community in Paris in particular, but in France more generally. And so the idea for the traffic barrier emerged because every Friday in the 18th arrondissement in Paris, there are two small mosques, and they used to be completely full. And so people would basically put prayer rugs on the road and close off these sort of tiny streets and turn the entire public space into kind of a large outdoor prayer hall. This was no longer acceptable, that prayer in public space like this was contrary to secularism. And so they directed the mosque overflow into a huge warehouse, essentially, on the outskirts of Paris, next to a homeless shelter and a prostitution corridor. The traffic barrier so says something both about Muslims in France, but also about secularism in France and the way in which the state is kind of trying to manage this Muslim population.
I've been doing field work in Mexico, and I found this doll. Folk art we think of as something that is eternal, or that it has a lot of continuity, but in fact, what people who are marginal are constantly doing is making new things for new markets and trying to survive at the margins. So I went to visit the family that made this, and it turned out that they were refugees from Lac Teal, which had a massacre in the church by paramilitaries. So everybody fled and were living in the area around San Cristobal. They had a 2-room house. In one room, it was filled with a loom. All of the dyes, all of the weaving, they made themselves. And to dye it, the father would go back in dark of night, walking 4 hours each way, because what he knew was the kind of weed that you could get near Lacteal to dye stuff. It would be a world of incredibly poor people in indigenous communities throughout Mexico. And it was soon after the year 2000 that for the first time, indigenous people from Chiapas migrated to the U.S. to become illegal migrant labor. And this is a measure of incredible desperation and oppression. If conditions were better in Mexico, my guess is that 80% of the people who've migrated would prefer to stay there.
I've chosen to recreate a shrine that one of the sleep doctors I used to work with had in his office, which is a collection of energy drinks and other kinds of caffeinated beverages. And part of putting that stuff together is thinking about how we selectively think about some stuff as being okay to stimulate ourselves with and other things as not being okay. Sometimes that's around discourses of naturalness, that some things like coffee are more natural than something like Red Bull. When we make those distinctions, we're also making kind of moral distinctions about what we want to consume and why we consume that stuff. The broader project is thinking about how natural or unnatural American sleep is. This shrine is a portal into our chemical world. So thinking about the ways in which very small things that we come into contact with all the time end up influencing our bodies or our being in society. So chemicals like caffeine are one of those things that we ingest all the time and change the way in which we're acting with other people and we act ourselves. Right?
I chose this jar, which came from Russia. A friend of mine gave it to me, and then I put all sorts of spare parts in this jar. And the reason I put this together is because Russians have been very good at recycling and repurposing objects for many, many years. They don't throw anything away because you never know when you might need something. And the backs of people's cars are always full of spare car parts in case their car breaks down or somebody else's car breaks down. And so I thought this was a really good representative object of kind of how people take their entire worlds with them all of the time. But this is changing in Russia today because this sort of collection came from a moment when people were used to having only one of something and they had to save everything until they might need it. And now it's no longer a society of multi-use objects, it's a society in which people throw things away when they're done with them.